Good morning. So nice to see everybody here and full of energy. My name is Vicki Seifert-Margolis. I am co-chair of the board of directors for the Every Life Foundation. Been involved with the foundation now. I think I'm among one of the longest people involved. In fact, was there at the very beginning during the discussions of the foundation of the foundation. So it's a real privilege to be here, and it's really wonderful to see how much the foundation and this community has grown. We're going to have 3 speakers on this panel, and this is going to be very focused on the FDA letter, the request for the task force. I'm just going to go through a few key background points again to just drive this stuff home. Our panelists are Isabel Lasauda, who is the president and CEO of the Amyloidosis Research Consortium. She's going to be telling, I would say, a sort of a success story. Matthew Ellenwood, who is the CSO of the National MPS Society, who has some very concrete ideas about a matrix that could form the basis of some solid decision-making components that could be brought into the FDA. And then, of course, our own Annie Kennedy, who's just a wonderful, wonderful person and a real force behind Every Life Foundation, who's going to go through the letter and some very concrete asks that we want to put forward. Hopefully, we definitely want to hear your questions. We'd like to keep this session focused on the FDA letter and the ask. So we know there's a million different topics of concern out there, but for this session, if we could try to focus on the FDA, that would be really terrific. So just to sort of reiterate, we know that one of the aims of the STAT Act, which unfortunately did not pass, was to improve rare disease coordination within the FDA by expanding the existing authority to create a rare disease center of excellence and inform rare disease policies and actions. Unfortunately, that did not happen. In addition, the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, CDER, did announce the launch of the Accelerating Rare Disease Cures program with the intent of speeding and increasing the development of effective and safe treatment options for addressing the unmet needs of patients with rare disease. This is a CDER-wide effort with leadership from several offices throughout the center. I believe you'll be hearing from a representative from the FDA later. And the rare disease community is working to develop policy proposals to improve this coordination across the centers. We know this is an issue, and the diseases across the FDA. So we want to hear directly from the FDA on how they're addressing this. And during this week, advocates, all you guys will have the opportunity to ask your members to join a congressional sign-on letter to the FDA requesting the formation of an internal FDA task force to review these agency-wide rare disease activities. So Annie, again, will wrap this up with some very concrete elements of the letter and key asks. So without further ado, I'd like to get started and introduce Isabel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and first and foremost, thank you to the Every Life Foundation for putting on this remarkable event and week that's so important for the rare disease community. I'm going to talk a little bit about the disease I work in, amyloidosis, which Janet Woodcock described as a poster child for rare diseases. I'm going to tell you about our experience of working with FDA and what it's taken to move the needle, and ultimately how this isn't reproducible for every rare disease. So just to give you a very quick overview, amyloidosis is a group of misfolded protein diseases. The protein, an abnormal protein, deposits in organs causing organ failure. There are 3 major types. One is considered potentially a rare cancer. Another one is age-related. And a third type is hereditary, which affects certain populations. In particular, 4% of African Americans carry the genetic mutation. We don't know what the full penetrance of that is. It's a very heterogeneous disease. Each patient is different. Depending where the amyloid deposits, depends which organs are affected. In 2012, the first drug was in development and came before the FDA. It failed to meet its primary endpoints and met its secondary. It failed to get approved in the US and has been approved in over 40 other countries, but still not in the US. And it really spoke to the fact that in a disease that's progressive with no treatments to date, it's very hard to know and to design a trial, particularly in a rare disease population. This drug was both safe and effective and has been approved actually for other indications now. We have had a number of companies, quite a large number of companies working. We go before 3 different divisions at FDA, depending where their endpoints are placed will depend. And even as we've heard earlier, we've been moved from some companies have been moved from one division to another. There was a real commitment working with us from the FDA to expand their knowledge. And in 2019, as a result of a lot of work that we'd done with our organization, we were invited to form a public-private partnership with FDA, which is known as the Amyloidosis Forum. And it means we can bring industry and stakeholders across the board together with FDA. And I really want to recognize the extraordinary commitment that the FDA have shown to us and to this forum. We have 7 divisions that work very closely with us in CEDA, and that comes down to 24 different members of FDA, including FDA statisticians. We developed a number of working groups, 7 working groups for each organ, so it's specific to different divisions, and even separate working groups within divisions who meet very regularly to develop what endpoints would look like, and as we try and look for multi-domain responder indexes and other novel ways to do trials. We've ended up developing a federated data analytics platform so that industry can share their data without having to give the data away, and we can really use that to analyze different endpoints and potential biomarkers. We've had a whole slew of publications, and to date we now have 5 approved therapies. The challenge is that we are now getting to a position where we can slow progression of the disease, but patients don't improve with the organ damage they have. So we need that second generation. And likewise, we're now moving to a point where it would be unethical to have placebo trials. So there's still a huge challenge. And the resources that are required to manage and run the forum and to change the sort of scientific course of this disease require huge, not only external collaboration, but internal resources to run this. We have a research team at ARC that have real expertise in clinical trial design and rare disease. So while this has been a phenomenal experience for us in the amyloidosis community, there is no way, resource-wise, from within the FDA or from an organization, a patient advocacy organization, that should have the expectations to be able to provide that kind of partnership. So I think it really speaks to the fact that for rare diseases, the challenge is huge, and we need to find ways that this sort of initiative can become reproducible and can really serve a much broader community.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to dive into that a little bit deeper. Our next panelist, Matthew.
Thank you, and thank you, Isabella. My name is Matthew Ellenwood. I represent the National MPS Society. Our diseases, in many respects, are emblematic of many struggles that are faced out in the rare disease community. We understand the biology of these diseases at this point. We have a theoretical framework for how to treat them, and after many years of not being able to gain interest, we have industry support. And I can tell you, for diseases in these situations, the biggest hurdle we face is with these systemic elements within the FDA. And I don't want to beat up on the FDA. If any of you sat through the Rare Disease Day for the FDA, you can't but come away and know these people have earnest and genuine goodwill to do right. But as we've heard, with over 10,000 of these diseases, it's a huge task to understand all the complexities that are relevant for them. So a lot of it is just making sure they have the infrastructure and the ability to treat our conditions both uniformly in the ways that they deserve, but also in particularity so they understand the difficulties we all face. And it's not just in any one center, whether you're dealing with a drug or a gene therapy. I have had in my experience conversations with people in some disease communities that say CDER, the division that does drugs, was great for them, but when they had a gene therapy and went to CBER, it was a disaster. And I also know from our perspective, it's been exactly the reverse. And that tells me these are not necessarily institutionalized problems within different centers. It's just getting them up to speed on our individual diseases. And that's why the ask about concordance and discordance between centers and divisions is so critical. And a lot of it comes down to giving tools to the FDA to understand how to approach a given disease. Vicki talked about the need for a matrix, which is one of the things I think of. That's not in our letters, but it's embedded in the idea of developing improvements. And that would be a matrix that people at the FDA could have filled out by a rare disease community that tells you the incidence, the age of onset, the length of disease, how critical things are. And that was really brought home to me when I was speaking with a gentleman from the FDA who said, I don't know much about Sanfilippo syndrome, but I know SMA got through the FDA without, it was difficult, but they're able to do it. What are the differences? SMA is 10 times more common. You can do a small screening trial within a large hospital setting, and sadly, the children succumb to their disease in 2 years. The readout's very clear. We need to give FDA the tools to understand all of these external metrics associated with our disease so they're not starting from zero every time. So a lot of it has to do with educating the individual people within the divisions and the centers so they can approach these things appropriately. And I know, I want to say something just about what warriors I think you all are. This is wonky policy, and I know from having walked the journey with families with these diseases, your minds are exploding knowing that the lives of your children, your family members, your very lives depend on these benefits. That you can coolly and calmly explain the needs for these sorts of improvements on policy issues while keeping everything else in check. I just think you guys are amazing. Thank you for what you do.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm going to go to the podium. I'm going to come here so that everyone on the other side of the room can see me too. And I brought show and share with me. So I'm going to try and make sure that everyone knows what the ask is for today, because Isabel and Matthew have done a really nice job giving us some examples around what we're talking about, but I just want to make sure that we're crystal clear when we go tomorrow around what we're asking for and why. And Chris on the previous panel provided some more context from the framework of our caucus co-chairs. But if you have your book in front of you, we're talking about page 16. And if you flip to page 16, you're going to get to page 16 and go, wah, wah. There is a lot of detail on page 16. Thanks, RDLA and Every Life. We appreciate that. Okay, so we're here to fill in the details. And the reason why there's so much detail is because our caucus co-chairs, or the leads, were working late until last night to finish this letter. So the other thing you're going to receive today are 2 pieces of paper later today. You're going to receive a copy of the final letter that we're going to give you some highlights from now. You are not responsible for knowing every element of this letter. That's the good news. You just need to know sort of the core essence of why we have this letter and a little bit about the mechanics of why a letter is important, which is what we're talking about up here. And then you're also going to receive a 1-pager that has a little bit more of a summary around this letter. These are considered resources for you and also leave-behinds for your meetings. The other thing is, thanks to technology, you also have these electronically in your app, and these are also being sent ahead to the offices that you're going to. So the offices will also have them. So if for some reason you forget them in your hotel room or at home or in your car tomorrow, don't freak out. Everybody's getting them anyway. But those are just some resources for you, okay? So, but for today, what we just want you to understand is why we're doing the letter
and a little bit about why the letter might have relevance to your or your family's or your loved one's journey with rare disease, why this is the vehicle we're choosing, and why our caucus leads chose this vehicle. So as Isabel and Matthew just articulated, as through different rare disease community lenses, there are some real important wins that we're getting from FDA. We saw yesterday that our friends in the Friedreich's ataxia community had their first ever approval in Friedreich's ataxia. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that approval was the first time we saw the use of a natural history comparator arm. And we'll dig into that later, but let me tell you that that is patient experience data come to life. So that, yeah, it's a really big deal. And that took some real, I think, innovation and some probably stand-up leadership on the part of some folks within FDA to do that. But we also know there are some real barriers within FDA. There are some real inconsistencies, as Matthew was just talking about, whether you're looking at products within cell and gene therapy or products within CDER, but then not even just the different divisions and centers, but even within divisions and centers, we often see a lot of inconsistencies depending on who's leading that, whether there are staff changes, whether you're talking about leadership or down further in the review division. And so what we're really just working towards, and what we were really leading when we were talking about STAT and establishing a center of excellence, for which there's already regulatory authority to do, we wanted a center of excellence in rare disease. We want those expertise within the FDA relevant to rare disease to be brought together and brought to bear so that regardless of what rare disease we're talking about, what product we're talking about, all those expertise are brought to bear on our product considerations. But FDA has brought some new innovations, new infrastructure in the meantime internally, and aren't sure that they need a center of excellence right now. We still feel like that's an important approach. So in the meantime, our caucus co-chairs, who also believe this is an important approach, would like to not just push and reintroduce STAT, because we also had some other wins in STAT. Many of you remember STAT wasn't just a center of excellence. We wanted an early payer engagement program. We wanted the Orphan Products Grants Program to be able to focus on regulatory science. We got that. So this room deserves a round of applause because those two things happened last year. But we still don't have the center of excellence. So what our caucus co-chairs are leading. So this is a congressionally led letter. This is not a community sign-on letter. We're not asking for patient advocacy groups to sign the letter. This is a letter led by the 4 caucus co-chairs, representatives of whom you saw 2 of their staffers up here this morning. They are leading the letter, and what they need is for other members of Congress to sign their names to the letter, and then that letter will go to the FDA. So this is Congress asking FDA to do something. And what we are doing is we are going to the Hill as members of the rare disease community and asking our members of Congress to sign the letter and telling them why it matters to us and why it needs to matter to them. And so we consider the members of the caucus, the Rare Disease Caucus, to sort of be low-hanging fruit, because I've already said we care about rare. And then we're going to get a lot of new members of the caucus. So we're going to get them enlisted. So that's just some context around what is a congressional sign-on letter. It's a mechanism used by members of Congress. It's something that's pretty commonly used, and we have some examples here, and I won't read the whole slide. But that is a tool used by members of Congress frequently. And it helps Congress demonstrate their authority. So what's in this letter? So this is just high level. You will get the letter. It'll have a lot more detail in it. You'll also have a one-pager that kind of gives an overview. The way this letter was developed was a community-led process. So as many of you know, Every Life convenes what we call our Community Congress, which is our coalition of patient advocacy organizations, industry partners, academics, other coalition partners. Those groups came together and provided draft concepts to go into this letter. Those concepts were offered to the caucus co-chairs, those 4 leads. Those 4 leads then took those ideas and finalized them into a letter. So our community offered draft ideas to Congress, and Congress then took those ideas and finalized them into the letter. So we had a lot of really important input into this letter. The top key ideas are that it is urging FDA to improve policy and consistency, so these are the themes you've heard us talk about, across the agency, specifically for the review of rare disease applications, products, and therapies, whether we're talking about devices, cell and gene therapies, or drugs. And the way that the Congress is asking FDA to do that is to create an internal agency task force. So a task force within FDA to, on a very high level, identify areas of strength and areas that challenge the efficient but appropriate review of therapies and products that are being developed for patients living with rare diseases. And when you see the letter, you will see an itemized list of suggested items that Congress would like FDA, the task force, to work on. And then they would like the task force to publicly issue specific recommendations to achieve greater alignment across the FDA. So there will be a lot more detail in the letter that you're going to have in front of you if you want to look at maybe specific details that resonate with your journey or your family or the product spaces that you're working within. But these are really, when you go to the meetings tomorrow, the simple ask is this: we would like Senator so-and-so, Representative so-and-so to join this letter being led by, and then you'll have the name of the caucus members who are leading the letter. That's the ask. Okay. Here are your hard copy samples. You'll have 3 things with you. Page 16, full of information, and 2 letter, a 1-pager and your letter. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. So as you can see, we're trying to be very targeted and specific. I'd like to ask each panelist, if they could, to talk about maybe 2 key elements that they think are important in this letter in terms of building a model that would help drive a more consistent review across the agency. So Isabel, why don't I start with you, since you have a lot of experience in working with the agency?
So, yeah, absolutely. I think and it's been stated several times, but the issues with the lack of communication between CEDA and CBER is huge. We've been pretty exclusively in CEDA, and we know that we're going to have some products come to CBER. So I think that's critical. And I also think we see inconsistencies across divisions about endpoints and flexibility. So I think it would be really helpful to get that framework to understand the variances between divisions.
And Matthew, how would you balance then the flexibility that's needed as part of this model, that we want in the review, while at the same time creating consistency, right? So that's a challenge. Where do you see these key elements that are important in this model?
Exactly, thank you. So our diseases share a number of basic pathobiological underpinnings. They are caused by the accumulation of certain toxins in the body. We know if we lower them, patients will be improved. We would like to get that as a primary endpoint for accelerated approval. In other words, it will act as a surrogate biomarker that's a primary endpoint. You lower this toxin in certain body compartments, that's enough to get you accelerated approval. And similar to what's happened with Friedreich's ataxia yesterday, I think once we start to get some of these improvements, we're going to see a cascade of understanding of the benefits to other disorders. So allowing primary disease activity biomarkers, or what we call surrogate biomarkers, to be used to lead to accelerated approval is one really important area. And I want you to understand, these are surrogates not because they don't reflect disease pathology. They're surrogates for what are traditionally measured by the FDA: clinical benefit. Does the patient feel better? They're not surrogates from a biological standpoint. They're the inciting toxin. And this sort of approach could be shared through dozens, if not hundreds, of disorders. That's one area. Another involves the structure of the initial and the confirming clinical trials. When people's lives are in the balance because of disease progression, when children's lives are in the balance, having a placebo-controlled arm or even a rescue control arm is absolutely unethical and cannot stand. We need to be able to use natural comparator arms, and for the ultra-rare community, we need to be able to use well-established literature precedents and not necessarily clinically controlled natural history data. For some of the ultra-rare diseases, that will never be a bar they can meet effectively. So those would be the big asks.
Thank you, Matthew. So Annie, I would like to add on or get your take again with respect to what's in this letter. I think this concept of natural history data is really, really key and important. Do you have any specifics you'd like to talk about with respect to how do we actualize that, and what are the things that we really want to lay foundationally down with respect to the agency? Now that we have one example of this, how can we build on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that really speaks to the need for predictability and consistency. So I think this is maybe a case where we point to the really good examples and the needing more good examples, but more predictability. One of the things we worry about is that, there has been guidance that has said that FDA could and should do this in the rare disease space, and we now have two recent examples. One was in ALS for their product, for Amylyx's product, and now the very recent, as of last night, approval for Friedreich's, where we've seen the use of natural history data in patient populations. But it's the lack of predictability around this that makes this, first of all, very hard to create incentives for funding the natural history studies, and also makes it very hard for companies and investors to work in this space. So these are the types of signals that we need from the agency, so we better understand when natural history data will be able to be used, how it's going to be used. The other thing that we don't talk about a lot with regard to natural history data is how much time and work and effort is expended by families who contribute to those natural history studies. And I know the next panel will be talking a little bit more about that, but most of these studies are funded by patient advocacy groups. They are very expensive to fund. They have to be supported over decades in order to be sustainable and valid. But they also require clinical visits over decades as well in order to be able to track disease progression. And so when we think about incentivizing the use of natural history data, we're not just talking about incentivizing it from the standpoint of companies utilizing the data in clinical trials. We have to talk about how do we make sure that the patient community feels that natural history data is going to be utilized and is going to be a worthy investment of that time when families are deciding whether or not you should be taking time off work and time away from school and traveling to that clinical site visit. So that's just to your point about natural history data. That's one of the things that we really need from the agency. The other thing, and I'm answering your first question, is when you get into this letter, you'll see there are two different areas that really speak to accelerated approval in here. And we really need more clarification around how accelerated approval is being regarded and applied, especially with respect to what's being asked within the confirmatory trial setting within rare, and we're seeing a lot of variability within centers and within the divisions now of what's being asked of companies that has really negative ramifications for our rare communities and our smaller populations. So there are a lot of elements as you dig into this that I think many people, as you look at the individual bullet points in this letter, will resonate for individual communities in this room.
Thank you. Okay, we can open this up for questions. See one back there, and over here.
Thank you. Hi, Eric Hartman with the Choroideremia Research Foundation. I really enjoyed what you were just talking about natural history data. And I am trying to see if there's an additional way for incentives for these large pharmaceuticals that have funded these very important natural history data. In my case, we've had 2 different trials that one went to phase 3, one went phase 1-2, but the one that went all through phase 3 didn't meet the primary endpoints. That data is sitting in their silos. It's been there for 6 years. And they have since pulled out of the ophthalmology arena for our eye disease. The question is, how can we get these large pharmaceuticals, or require that if they're looking for accelerated pathways, they need to be able to also prove that they've been giving access to depersonalized natural data that could go to the FDA-funded Critical Path Institute or RareX or any of the other possible places that we can get the natural history data, where we can then use that as potential endpoints for future trials.
I can start. I think there are a number of people on the panel that can answer this. But I think you helped answer the question in your question. I think there are some really wonderful resources out there that are doing exactly what you just posed as the question, trying to incentivize companies to bring their data together. The Critical Path initiative that you mentioned is absolutely one of them. I think one of the hardest pieces of this is getting some of the companies to agree to participate in these data sharing efforts, especially if there's safety data or placebo data. That's where we often see it happening. But there are a number of success stories in the room of communities that have successfully brought together consortia of partners that have brought their data together and then streamlined that data for the exact use that you're referencing. But I don't know if Nikki or Matthew.
I would add to this that I think that this is a really important point. I worked at the agency from 08 to 15 in the commissioner's office. And the failed clinical trials data is critically important. The unfortunate reality is that it does sit there, and many of the companies don't want to reveal the data that's involved in trials that don't meet endpoint. But I think that this is something that, as advocates who are critical to the enrollment of these studies, that may be the time to push on the issue is at the outset of these studies, because everybody needs you. You're the patients. And sharing of this data is critical to advancing therapies. We need to understand our failures as much as we need to understand our successes. So I think this is a really important point.
I also think there's been tremendous improvements in the way trials begin. Many of the difficulties of getting access to this legacy data involves when they were done and the consents that were involved. In many cases, there is great goodwill on the companies. They want to provide it, but they feel from a legal framework they cannot. I think if you approach them and bring them solutions that confront the consenting issues, et cetera, you will see things start to move. We are in this space very heavily. Another issue is it doesn't necessarily all need to be streamlined and aggregated in one site, because many of these studies are so small or have such small populations. There are platforms when individual studies can be uploaded as de-identified data, such as Vivli. There are others. There's a way forward, and especially with trials that are initiated in the future, currently and in the future, getting consents right from the beginning will help that process.
Outstanding point.
And I would just add, what we did to address this with companies that didn't want to give up their data was actually create this federated data analytics platform. So they each hold on to their data. We have statisticians that we work with, and they provide the coding to run through their data, and we just get the aggregated results. And that's been a phenomenal way to do it. We've had buy-in from all the companies to do that.
Great comments. Thank you. Next question.
Hi, I wanted to ask, in that letter, is there specifically something about off-label drug use? And if it's not, what can we ask of our Congress people and Senate for those of us who have rare illnesses where our doctors feel that another type of drug is useful for us, but we have to pay out of pocket when we have Medicare?
So I think I'm seeing Dion in the back of the room. The microphone, I think it didn't start until where you asked about off-label drug use and then access. So this letter focuses specifically on regulatory infrastructure, which that does start to creep into what the labels look like in approval. So there is a line that does talk about labeling changes, but with respect to post-approval labels. This letter, Congress did not spend much time talking about the access environment in this letter. They're really focused on FDA issues. So that answers your first part of the question. Related to access issues, we do have an access working group, which you may or may not be a part of, as a part of our community congress. So if you're interested in looking at some of the access issues that we're working on, I'd be happy to talk to you about that, because those are some of the things that we're interested in working on.
We're here? Oh, way over there? Okay.
Hi, and thanks for all this information. I think the provisions of the letter, of course, sound fantastic. It's hard to argue with better coordination of experts across the FDA. But I am wondering, since unfortunately nothing's as simple as it seems sometimes, what are potential objections that you might anticipate among the congressional staffers, and how might we address those objections?
Okay, that's a really good question. Well, I mean, I guess a member of Congress could object to anything these days. I mean, we actually did try when I don't know. I'm not a member of Congress, so I don't know. I mean, I can't imagine what you'd object to with members of the rare disease community saying we want better consistency within FDA. That said, I think there are members of Congress that don't want to dictate how FDA does their job. So I think we always run into that when there are congressional asks. But this letter, and I know that our caucus members, when we were talking to them, were trying to be very high level and to not go too far into the weeds. So I do know that what they wanted to do, and there were also discussions around who else should be on this task force, and the caucus members also wanted to make sure that this was just a task force of FDA personnel, so that it was an internal agency task force, so that they would maybe steer off any other objections FDA would have to others coming inside and telling FDA how to do their business. So it was an assessment internally of the way that FDA could address some of these issues. So I think our caucus chairs were very thoughtful already around wanting to have a letter that would have as much congressional strength as possible, as many people on both sides of the aisle and in both chambers who would agree to signing, and that they tried to really think through some of what those objections could be as they constructed the letter. So I think that's a really terrific question, and I'm sure there will be some objections that are raised, or maybe some concerns or questions that might get raised, and we would encourage you to put those into the notes in your app so that we can circle back with offices if offices have questions, and we'll do some follow-up. But I do know that the leads on this letter spent a lot of time thinking through that and really are trying to think of approaches that will be beneficial to our overall community, are really trying to be thoughtful about how we can make sure that FDA has the resources that they need to serve our community optimally, and to do an internal assessment of what's needed in order to do that.
I think one thing that I've heard historically is a concern by some members of lowering the bar, and I just think it's very important to point out that that's not what this is about. This is really about taking into account what's best for patients, and that integrity and scientific standards obviously will be maintained to the level that's feasible and appropriate for addressing these diseases. And I think that's a very important component of ensuring that we're not talking about, bad science.
One last quick clarification. Great question. I believe forewarned is forearmed. I think with respect to accelerated approval, There may be some objection that for large indications such as Alzheimer's, where accelerated approval has been used, and it may be controversial, they may be viewing accelerated approval expansion as not in the best interests of the country at large, so to speak. I don't believe in a zero-sum game. I think accelerated approval should be used all over the place where it's appropriate. So just to let you know, some may bring up specific objections along those lines. Accelerated approval for our diseases is in many cases, if not most, the only life-saving, life-preserving action we can take.
And just to be clear, I 1,000% agree with that. But I just want to be clear, we're not asking for specific actions around any of these things. The letter is asking for them to sign on to a letter to establish an interagency task force to assess the following. So we're not asking for movement on any of the following issues. We're asking for the establishment of a task force. That's the ask.
Excellent clarification.
Thank you. I really like the letter. Thank you for doing this. My question is, rare disease drugs are the most expensive drugs in the world, with like the gene therapies costing millions of dollars. And do you think the FDA would be more cooperative if we could get the price of the drugs down, where they'd go, oh, it's not that expensive, we can approve this? And I know they can't decide their drugs on the cost, but cost is stopping everything. Who can afford these drugs? And so how do we get them involved? They won't talk about cost. They're like, that's not our job. But it's a stumbling block. You can't get past it. There's millions of dollars for these drugs. So how can we get the cost of the drugs down so the FDA can go, oh, we can approve these drugs. They're not that expensive.
So I don't think that any of the barriers that we have related to what we're talking about here are so I 100% understand what you're saying. I think FDA understands the cost of research and development in rare therapies. I mean, they're scientists and they're developers. One of the reasons that we've done so much work around the economic impact in rare disease is because when we talk about the impact of moving therapies forward and impacts of formulary decisions, we never have that conversation from the entire impact of the lived experience of rare disease. And so it's really important to us in the rare disease community that we take a step back and we don't just make formulary decisions based on a very short-sighted determination, but we talk about how much did that diagnostic odyssey cost? How much does one ER admission cost? How much does one NICU stay cost? And for some reason, those are never a part of the consideration. It's just we just talk about that annual cost of the new product, and we can never talk about it in terms of overall outcomes, et cetera. So from our perspective, at least at EveryLife, we are not getting into the discussion around how companies come up with the prices of their products. We are getting into the conversation around, if we're actually gonna have the conversation, let's have a real conversation around how much it costs to live with a rare disease, because we just published data that showed that nobody's talking about the 60% of the costs that are coming directly out of the pockets of families living with rare diseases, and nobody's paying attention to that. That's just the doctor hands you a prescription and nobody's helping you fill it. You just have to do that on your own. That being said, to pull it back to this, I really appreciate your question. FDA has a lot of barriers around therapeutic development that have nothing to do with the fulfillment of that product. And I know it is frustrating when you hear regulatory authorities say, well, that's not my problem. We just approved it. How it gets filled isn't my problem. But truly, there are so many barriers within the therapeutic development that FDA keeps moving the goalposts on developers, and the unpredictability even around what we're going to measure, what outcomes matter, and whether the outcomes that are being developed are actually aligning with what patients are saying matters in their life. We have so many problems at the early stages of development and around the regulatory approvals that we have to get sorted out before we even get to that approval space. And so when we talk about this letter, we're really focused on that space. And we are very committed to working on making sure that once we get an approved product, we have access to them also, without getting into drug pricing conversations, but making sure there's access, and we remove some of those hurdles, and we work with those payers. But this letter is really focused on FDA, how we make sure that FDA is being consistent and predictable, and that we have a space that is ripe for development for our rare diseases so that everybody can be celebrating like our Friedrichs community is today, because every one of us in this room deserves that.
Great. With that, we're going to have to end this panel. I think the next panel is here. Thank you to our panelists.